He spent his last $600 buying a rusted container from an abandoned yard, thinking he would just scrap it for metal. But when he opened the doors and saw what was inside, his heart froze. Subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The morning light bled through the cracked windshield of the van, cutting across the dust that hung in the air like fog. Samuel Brown sat in the driver's seat, his shoulders hunched, the sleeves of his flannel rolled up past scarred forearms. The old Chevy had long since stopped being a vehicle and turned into a coffin for a man who hadn't yet died. The seats smelled of oil and rain. The floor was littered with empty coffee cups, cigarette butts, and screws that no longer fit anything. Somewhere outside, a train moaned through the industrial zone, and its whistle echoing over the quiet sprawl of warehouses that no one had used in years. He had grown used to that sound. It was like a clock reminding him that the world was still moving while he stayed stuck in place. He rubbed the sleep from his eyes and stared at the same reflection that had haunted him for years. A man in his late 40s, dark skin gone gray from exhaustion, hair more salt than pepper, a jaw that had forgotten what a smile felt like. The lines across his forehead were deep now, carved from years of frowning and working without seeing progress. He used to have hands that built engines. Now they just held coffee and regret. The van smelled faintly of gasoline and old sweat. On the dashboard lay a single photograph, edges curling from heat. His two sons grinned at the camera, one missing a front tooth, the other clutching a toy truck. That photo was 6 years old, the last one before their mother packed up and left for Louisiana with a new job and a man who wasn't broken. Samuel had stayed behind, telling himself he'd rebuild, find work, call them when things got better. But things never got better. They just stopped getting worse long enough for him to breathe. He lived on the edge of Ironfield, a forgotten town that had once been an industrial artery. The factories were gone now, replaced by silence and weeds pushing through cracked asphalt. He had worked at Reynolds and Company Transport for almost 2 decades, fixing engines, welding frames, keeping the trucks alive while the company bled itself dry. When it folded, no one even called him. The notice came by mail. Operations suspended effective immediately. He'd stood there that morning in the parking lot with a few dozen others, holding that letter like a death certificate. That was years ago. Since then, he had worked wherever he could, repairing forklifts, stripping old vehicles for parts, even collecting scrap metal from junkyards. Each week, the money barely covered food and fuel. His hands remained busy, but his life idled. People in town had started to forget his name. Some called him Scrap Sam, others the old vet. Nobody said mechanic anymore. That title required hope. It was late afternoon when he wandered into the small internet cafe near the bus station, a place where truckers stopped for coffee and kids came to play games. He wasn't there for either. The computers were slow, but they worked. Samuel logged into one of the auction websites he used for scavenging tools and parts. That's when he saw it. Lot 47B. The listing was brief, almost careless. Shipping container, unknown contents, located at Ironfield Storage Yard, sold as is. The single photo attached was blurred, taken from too far away to see much detail. Just a red-brown rectangle, rusted and half hidden by weeds. The starting bid was $600. Most people would scroll past something like that. Samuel didn't. He stared at the screen for a long time, tapping his thumb against the mouse. He could almost feel the weight of those digits. $600. That was exactly what he had left after selling his last box of spare alternators. 600 $12.17. He told himself it was emergency money, but lately, every day felt like an emergency. What would he even do with a container? Maybe strip the metal, sell it by the pound. Maybe there'd be some tools or machinery inside. The listing said nothing about inspection, nothing about contents. Unknown. The word had a pull on him. Unknown meant possibility, and possibility was something he hadn't tasted in years. That night, he lay in the back of his van, unable to sleep. Rain drummed softly on the metal roof, leaking through a crack near the edge. He set an empty can under it, listening to the rhythmic tapping. He thought about the container, how it stood there somewhere behind the old yard, forgotten, sealed. He thought about the way his life had become just that. Sealed, rusted, forgotten. Maybe that was why he couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting for him. He closed his eyes and pictured the yard. He had been there once, back when Reynolds used to send shipments through the Ironfield hub. Rows of cranes, forklifts, containers stacked like dominoes, men shouting through the noise. Now it was a graveyard. Half the town avoided that place. They said it was full of rats and needles, a home for ghosts of the old industry. Samuel almost smiled at that. He knew what it meant to live among ghosts. By dawn, he made up his mind. He returned to the cafe before sunrise, his breath fogging in the cold air. The owner unlocked the door and gave him a curious look. "Back again?" Samuel just nodded. He sat at the same computer, entered his name, and clicked Place Bid. His hand hesitated for half a second before pressing Enter. The confirmation screen blinked. "Congratulations, you are the current highest bidder for Lot 47B. He sat back, exhaling through his teeth. For a moment, it felt like nothing changed. Then, a thin pulse of excitement stirred under his ribs. He hadn't felt that in a long time. The next 24 hours crawled by. He spent the day checking the listing every hour, half expecting someone else to outbid him. No one did. By evening, the auction closed. A notification popped up. Winning bidder, Samuel Brown. He was instructed to confirm payment and arrange pickup. He walked to the gas station across the street and used the ATM. The screen blinked as his account emptied. The last of his money vanished into someone else's hands. The receipt fluttered in the wind as he walked back to the van. He leaned against the door, staring at the numbers on the paper. 0 balance. That night, he couldn't stop thinking about what he'd done. He'd spent his last chance on something that could easily turn out to be worthless scrap. But he also knew that it didn't matter anymore. He'd been worthless scrap himself for years. Maybe this was his way of proving that not everything rusted beyond repair. The delivery was scheduled for the next morning. He cleaned up his workspace behind the abandoned warehouse he used as a workshop, swept the floor, moved the spare tires and engines aside. It was the closest thing he had to home. The concrete smelled of oil and heat. He imagined the container standing there, solid, heavy, real. He didn't know why, but the thought gave him a strange kind of peace. At dusk, he made a small fire in a metal drum and sat beside it. The sky over Ironfield was bruised purple, the air thick with the scent of rain. He warmed his hands over the flames and thought about the years that had slipped by like smoke. Every decision he'd made since losing the factory had been about survival. This was the first time he'd acted out of something else. Something like defiance. He remembered his father's words, spoken decades ago in a small Alabama garage. "Son, a man can lose his job, his house, even his family. But if he stops believing he can fix something, he's gone." Those words had followed him his whole life, buried somewhere beneath the noise. Now, sitting alone with the firelight dancing across his tired face, he whispered them again. The night stretched on. The flames died down, leaving only embers. Samuel climbed into his van, pulled a blanket over his shoulders, and watched the sky through the windshield. Somewhere out there, a rusted shipping container waited, just another forgotten hunk of metal among thousands. But for reasons he couldn't explain, it felt like the start of something. Not a miracle, not redemption, just movement. A flicker in a life that had been still for too long. As the rain returned, tapping softly on the roof, he felt a small, quiet certainty settle in his chest. Tomorrow, the container would arrive. Tomorrow, he would open it. And whatever waited inside, good or bad, would be his. He closed his eyes and let the sound of the rain carry him into uneasy sleep, unaware that the choice he made that night, the simple click of a button, would lead him deeper into the heart of his own forgotten past, buried under layers of steel, dust, and silence. The container arrived the next morning under a gray, restless sky. Samuel heard the rumble of the truck long before it reached the yard, the low diesel growl cutting through the fog that clung to the ground like smoke. He stood, waiting near the loading area, hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets, breath clouding in front of him. The driver was a thick man in a reflective vest who barely looked up as he maneuvered the rig into position. When the trailer tilted, the old shipping container groaned, its weight pressing against the rusted chains that held it steady. Samuel felt something inside him tighten in response, an old instinct from years around machinery, the knowledge that metal could remember the hands that built it. The driver jumped down, wiped his nose with the back of his glove, and nodded toward the container. "Here's your coffin," he said with a half-smile, "where you want it." Samuel pointed to the far edge of the yard near the cinder block wall that shielded his workshop from the street. The man shrugged, climbed back up, and eased the load into place. The container hit the ground with a deep, hollow thud that echoed across the empty lot. Dust rose, mingling with the exhaust smoke. When the truck finally pulled away, the silence that followed was heavier than before. Samuel approached the container slowly. It was even bigger than it looked in the photo, 20 feet long, streaked with rust that looked almost like dried blood. The red paint had faded to a dull brown, blistered and flaking, the metal beneath exposed like bone. On one side, the number 47B was faintly visible, the digits uneven and scorched as if someone had tried to erase them with heat. He ran a hand over them, feeling the roughness beneath his calloused palm. The locks were industrial, solid steel bars that had fused slightly from corrosion. He crouched down, studying the hinges. Whoever had sealed this thing hadn't meant for it to be opened easily. The padlock was thick, the kind used in freight transport decades ago. He recognized the make. Reynolds and Company had used the same kind back in the 80s. The realization made him pause. Could this container have come from one of their yards? He shook off the thought. There was no reason for it to be connected. Ironfield was full of abandoned freight, hundreds of forgotten units scattered after the collapse of the old industries. It was probably coincidence. He went to fetch his cutting tools. Inside the workshop, the air smelled of rust and motor oil. He pulled the extension cord toward the yard, the plug sparking faintly as he connected it. When he pressed the trigger, the grinder screamed to life, showering the lock with sparks. The noise was sharp, echoing off the nearby buildings, but there was no one to complain. The blade chewed through the steel slowly, each inch a small victory. Sweat gathered under his collar despite the cold. After 20 minutes, the lock gave way with a crack. He shut off the grinder and listened. Only the soft ticking of cooling metal answered him. The air seemed to hold its breath. Samuel wiped his forehead and gripped the heavy door handles. The steel was cold, the texture rough with years of neglect. He pulled once. Nothing. Again, harder. The hinges groaned, resisting. He put his shoulder into it, and finally, with a low, dragging moan, the right door opened a few inches, releasing a gust of stale air. It smelled of dust and something older, oil, rubber, the faint sweetness of decay. He froze for a second, waiting for any sign of movement, any sound from within. Nothing. The silence that spilled out of the container felt almost physical, like water seeping around him. He swung the door wider and stepped back. Sunlight cut across the darkness, revealing a shape inside, massive and covered with a weather-stained tarp. At first, his mind refused to interpret it. The outline suggested a vehicle, maybe a small truck or loader. He stepped closer, the crunch of gravel under his boots loud in the quiet. The tarp was beige, its edges frayed, the corners pinned down by rusted tools. He reached out, tugged at one corner, and the fabric came loose with a puff of dust. What it revealed made his throat tighten. Beneath the tarp was a truck, an old transport model, maybe from the late 70s. The paint was chipped and faded, the chrome dulled, but the frame was intact. Across the side door, just barely visible through the grime, was the logo, Reynolds and Company Transport. The sight hit him like a blow. He hadn't seen that logo in decades, not since the factory gates had closed. For a moment, he simply stood there, staring at it, his pulse beating in his ears. He circled the truck slowly, his hands tracing the edges of the bodywork. The tires were flat, but not rotted through. The glass was intact, though cloudy with time. He brushed the dust from the license plate. No numbers, just a scratched surface where someone had scraped them off. Whoever had hidden this didn't want it traced. He found a set of crates stacked in the corner, each marked with faded stencils, shipping numbers, dates, and words too faint to read. He pried one open with a crowbar. Inside were wrenches, bolts, and machine parts wrapped in oily paper. Everything smelled of age, but not abandonment. The tools were arranged too neatly, the truck covered too carefully. This wasn't junk thrown away. It was preserved. He stepped back, letting his eyes wander over the interior of the container. The floor bore the imprint of tires and boot prints, frozen in dust. On one wall, someone had scrawled letters in chalk, now half erased. He could make out only a few. Keep sealed, followed by a date he couldn't fully read. The year ended with 7. Maybe 1987. Samuel sat in a crate and let the weight of it all sink in. The wind whistled softly through the small gaps in the container's frame. He tried to imagine the hands that had closed those doors for the last time. The person who had decided this truck should vanish. There was a strange kind of reverence to the way it had been hidden. By noon, the sun had burned through the clouds, flooding the yard with light. Samuel stepped back outside, blinking against the brightness. The world felt too alive compared to the stillness inside. He poured himself coffee from a thermos and leaned against the container, thinking, what was this truck doing here? Why hide it instead of scrapping it like the rest? And why did it have to be this container, the one he'd somehow chosen out of hundreds? He tried to tell himself it was coincidence. Life was full of coincidences, especially in places like Ironfield. But part of him, the same instinct that used to guide his hands when an engine was whispering its problems, told him this wasn't random. After a while, he went back in, opened the driver's door of the truck, and climbed inside. The hinges resisted, then gave with a sharp creak. The seat was stiff but surprisingly intact, the leather cracked yet not torn. He wiped the dust from the steering wheel, revealing more of that familiar logo embossed at the center. His reflection stared back from the rearview mirror, the same tired man, older, worn down, but now with something new in his eyes, a spark of curiosity. He opened the glove compartment. It was empty except for a folded maintenance log and a small brass key taped to the inside. The log listed dates and signatures he half recognized. The last entry was dated March 1987. The mileage recorded was low, too low for a working transport vehicle. That didn't make sense. He flipped through the pages until one name caught his eye: R. Coleman, supervisor. Samuel remembered that name. Coleman had been head of operations at Reynolds & Company, the man who had signed the closure notice that ended Samuel's career. He sat back, clutching the logbook, the brass key still in his hand. It was small, plain, but engraved with the number 09. He turned it over, running his thumb along the grooves, wondering what had opened. The hours slipped by as he cleaned and examined every inch of the truck. Under the driver's seat, he found old paperwork, shipment manifests, and a coffee tin full of bolts. Most of it was mundane, but one folder stood out, a manila envelope sealed with tape. He tore it open. Inside were photographs. The truck, parked in what looked like a testing facility surrounded by men in work uniforms. The same logo appeared on their jackets. One of the men in the background wore a suit and tie. Coleman. Samuel's stomach twisted. He turned the photos over, expecting dates or notes, but found nothing. Just silence captured on paper. He stacked them back into the envelope and stared at the truck again. The afternoon light shifted, casting long shadows across the floor. The dust in the air caught the beams like smoke. He sat there, breathing it in, feeling something stir, a sense of connection maybe, or purpose. For years he had moved through life like a man walking underwater, every step heavy and slow. But now, here was something tangible, something from his past reaching out of the ground to pull him back into meaning. He didn't yet understand it, but he could feel it deep in his bones. This truck, this container, was not just scrap. It was a message from the years that had defined him. It carried the echoes of a life before everything went wrong. And, for the first time in a long while, Samuel wanted to follow where it led. As the sun began to set, he locked up the workshop and stood for a moment, looking at the container from across the yard. The setting light turned the rust to gold, the scars to texture. It almost looked beautiful. He thought about the auction listing, how it had been buried among thousands of others unnoticed, how he'd chosen it by chance. Maybe, he thought, it had chosen him instead. He climbed into his van, started the engine, and sat there a long moment before driving off. The reflection of the container lingered in the side mirror until he turned the corner and it vanished behind the wall. But its weight stayed with him, the feeling that something inside that steel box had just opened a door he couldn't close again. That night, back in the van, he couldn't sleep. The smell of oil still clung to his clothes. The image of the old logo burned behind his eyelids. He kept seeing that number on the brass key, 09, turning over and over in his mind. Outside, rain began to fall again, soft and steady. He listened, the same way he had listened the night before, when the idea of the container had been just a dream. Only now it was real. And somewhere in that rusted truck, In the papers and photos and the faint scent of forgotten years, a truth waited for him to uncover it. He lay there with his hands behind his head, staring into the dark, and knew he wouldn't be able to walk away. The container had arrived, but it wasn't done arriving. It had brought the past back with it, and when the morning came, he would be there again, ready to keep opening whatever doors it had left for him. By dawn, the fog had settled low over Ironfield, thick enough that the outlines of buildings looked like the ghosts of a town that had forgotten how to wake up. Samuel parked his van by the workshop and stepped out into the cold air. The gravel crunched under his boots, the sound loud in the silence. The container stood where he had left it, dark and hulking in the gray light, its sides slick with dew. The rain from the night before had left streaks running down the rust, as though the thing itself had been weeping through the night. He hadn't slept much. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that logo, the one painted on the truck door. Reynolds and Company Transport. It had been years since he'd even spoken that name aloud. Back when the factory shut down, he had packed away everything with the company's mark on it. His badge, his uniform, the tools he'd been allowed to keep. He couldn't bring himself to look at them anymore. But seeing that logo again had stirred something he thought he'd buried for good. The air inside the container was cold and heavy. He stepped in carefully, the beam of his flashlight slicing through the gloom. Dust motes hung suspended in the air like fragments of memory. The truck waited exactly as he had left it the day before, still half covered with the tarp, the metal of its hood faintly reflecting the light. He started by opening the crates again, this time taking inventory of every item. Each box held something different. Bolts, old wrenches, machine grease hardened into amber. Everything was from another time. He found a can of motor oil so old the label had faded into nothing. When he shook it, he could hear the thick liquid slosh inside. It made him smile for the first time in days. Even forgotten oil had more purpose than he did some mornings. But he wasn't here to count relics. The truck was what mattered. He climbed into the driver's seat, the cracked leather creaking under his weight. He ran his hand along the dashboard, over the cracked vinyl, down the cold edge of the steering wheel. Something about it felt too deliberate, too clean, too intact. Vehicles abandoned for decades didn't stay this well preserved. He'd seen enough junked engines to know that nature always won. This truck had been protected. He slid to the floor and began inspecting the undercarriage. His flashlight beam caught something metallic glinting beneath the seat, something wedged deep between the floorboards and the frame. He reached in, his fingers scraping against steel until he caught the edge of it. When he pulled it free, he realized it was a small metal box, no bigger than a lunch tin. It was dented, the paint chipped, but the clasp still worked. Inside, beneath a layer of dust, were documents. Folded papers yellowed with age and the faint smell of oil. Shipping manifest, delivery receipts, and something else. A packet of photographs bound by a rubber band that snapped the moment he touched it. The photos spilled into his lap. Most were grainy, black and white, showing the truck parked in front of large, hangar-like buildings. Others showed men in hard hats, groups of workers standing beside it. He leaned closer, squinting. The more he looked, the more he felt a strange unease rising inside him, because he recognized the place. The background in one of the photos, the concrete lot, the pattern of light poles, was from the Ironfield freight yard decades ago. He'd worked there. He could almost hear the echoes of men shouting orders, forklifts beeping, the smell of diesel in the air. It wasn't just any old truck hidden in this container. It had been part of the same system that had built his entire life and then destroyed it. He set the photos aside and unfolded one of the manifests. The handwriting was careful, Lupin, and the paper carried the official Reynolds and Company letterhead. He scanned the lines, noting dates and destinations: Chicago, Baton Rouge, Houston, but the cargo descriptions didn't make sense. Reclaimed materials, industrial waste, defense components. He frowned. The company had never dealt with anything military. They'd transported heavy machinery, not classified material. Then he saw the signature at the bottom of the page: R. Coleman, Operations Director. He stared at the name for a long moment, memories surfacing one by one. Coleman had been a hard man, tall, always in pressed shirts and polished shoes, even on the factory floor. He used to give speeches about loyalty and dedication while firing men for being 5 minutes late. When the plant closed, Coleman was the only one who walked away richer. Rumor had it he sold off the company's assets under a shell corporation, pocketed millions, and vanished into politics. Samuel felt his jaw tighten. He'd spent years blaming himself for what happened, telling himself he hadn't worked hard enough, hadn't seen the warning signs. But now, holding that paper, he saw it clearly. The collapse hadn't been a tragedy. It had been a theft. He kept reading. Another manifest, dated a few months later, showed large sums of money moving through phantom accounts. The destinations changed. Smaller towns, less oversight. It looked like someone had been moving something through those trucks, hiding it under fake shipping labels, maybe weapons, maybe stolen parts. Whatever it wasn't legal. He flipped to the last page in the stack. This one wasn't signed. Instead, it had a handwritten note scrawled across the top margin. Keep this unit off the books. Remove registration before transport. Notify Coleman directly. Samuel sat back, his heart pounding in his chest. The words blurred as his mind raced. This wasn't just evidence of fraud. This was something bigger, something that had cost hundreds of people their livelihoods. He thought of the men he'd worked beside: Carl, who'd hung himself after losing his pension; Jamal, who'd moved his family 3 states away, only to end up working security at a warehouse. The closure of Reynolds had ruined them all. And now, after decades, here lay the truth inside a rusted container no one was supposed to open. He stood, pacing the narrow space, the papers clutched in his hand. Every nerve in his body buzzed with energy. For the first time in years, he felt awake, furious, but awake. He could almost hear his father's voice again, calm and steady. A man who knows the truth and hides it ain't much better than the one who buried it. The words echoed in his head. He needed to know how deep this went. He checked the rest of the truck, searching for anything else hidden away. Under the passenger seat, he found another compartment, this one sealed with screws. He pried it open with his screwdriver, revealing a small leather ledger covered in grease. Inside were more notes, some written in shorthand he didn't understand, others clearly listing shipment numbers, dates, and initials. Some of those initials matched the names of men he used to know from the factory office. He found his own name on one line, S. Brown, listed under Delivery Unit 12, Payroll Adjustments. His stomach dropped. They'd used his name to sign off on one of the transfers, a forgery, obviously, but if anyone had ever looked, it would have looked like he was part of it. Maybe that was why no one had called him when the company went down. Maybe he had been an easy scapegoat, another expendable worker whose signature could cover a crime. He sat back on the cold floor, the papers spread around him. The weight of it all pressed against his chest. He had stumbled onto something that explained not just his own fall, but the fall of everyone who'd ever worn that uniform. Coleman had buried the evidence, sealed it in this container, and walked away. And, by sheer accident, or fate, Samuel had unearthed it. Outside, a wind kicked up, whistling through the yard. The light shifted, spilling across the truck's faded emblem. He stood slowly, gathering the documents, stacking them neatly on the crate. There was a part of him that wanted to walk away, to lock the doors again, and pretend he'd never seen any of it. He could still sell the metal, scrap the truck, get a few $100s. He needed the money more than he needed answers. But when he looked at that old logo again, something hardened inside him. The men who'd built those trucks, who'd stood in that factory shoulder to shoulder, hadn't deserved what happened to them. He couldn't walk away. He tucked the manifests and photos into his satchel and stepped out into the daylight. The sky had cleared, the sun pale and sharp through the cold air. For the first time in years, he felt purpose in his stride. That evening, he sat in his van with the papers spread across the passenger seat. He read them again under the flickering glow of the overhead light. The details formed a map of corruption. Names, places, signatures, all threads leading back to Coleman. Samuel began to write them down in his own notebook, organizing the information the way he used to organize engine schematics. Each document was a gear, each signature a bolt. Together, they built something ugly but precise. Proof. When night fell, he packed everything carefully back into the box and locked the container doors behind him. The padlock clicked shut, but this time the sound didn't mean closure. It meant protection. He knew now that what sat inside wasn't just an old truck. It was evidence of betrayal, of greed, of everything that had broken his life apart. He leaned against the container for a long time, feeling the cold seep into his skin. The streetlights flickered on, one by one, casting thin cones of yellow across the yard. In the distance, a train passed, its horn echoing low and mournful. Samuel watched it fade into the darkness, wondering how many other ghosts Ironfield still held beneath its rust and silence. When he finally climbed back into his van, exhaustion hit him all at once. But beneath it, under the ache in his bones and the hollow hunger in his stomach, there was something else. Something fierce and alive. For the first time in a long while, he had something to fight for. He didn't yet know how deep the lies went, or who might come looking for what he'd found. But one thing was certain. He wasn't done. The rusted walls of the container had whispered their first secret, and Samuel Brown intended to hear the rest. The wind came in hard from the east the next morning, carrying with it a sharp edge that sliced through the quiet of Ironfield. The sky had turned the color of dull iron, and the air smelled of rain that hadn't yet fallen. Samuel sat in his van with the engine running, letting the heater fight off the cold while he stared through the windshield at the shipping container across the yard. It looked different now. Not just a rusted box, but a vault holding something dangerous. He'd barely slept again, the weight of what he'd discovered pressing down on him like an engine block on his chest. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those signatures, those forged lines that had stolen not only his life, but the lives of every man who'd once called that factory home. He took another sip of bitter coffee, trying to clear the fog from his mind. The documents lay on the passenger seat, stacked neatly, each page a relic of betrayal. He didn't know what to do next. He wasn't a lawyer, wasn't a journalist, just a man who fixed things. Except this wasn't something he could fix with a wrench. It required something heavier, something that risked more than he'd ever risked before. Still, the thought of doing nothing clawed at him. It would mean accepting that people like Coleman could destroy others and bury the evidence under rust and dust, confident no one would ever care enough to dig it up. When the coffee was gone, he reached for the small notebook where he'd begun to write down everything he'd found. Dates, names, numbers. It looked more like a confession than a plan. He thought about the men he used to know, about their faces on the last day at Reynolds, the silence that hung over the lot when the final shift ended. He remembered the foreman handing him his last check and saying, "Sorry, Sam, it's just business." Those words had followed him for years, festering like rust. Now he finally understood what that meant. It had never been about business. It had been about theft, greed, and cowardice. By mid-morning, he made up his mind. He couldn't just sit here. He gathered the envelope of photographs and manifests, packed them into his satchel, and drove toward town. The streets were nearly empty, the few people outside moving quickly through the cold. The Ironfield Gazette office sat on Main Street, a squat brick building wedged between an insurance agency and a pawn shop. He parked out front and climbed the steps, his boots echoing in the narrow stairwell. Inside, the place smelled of ink and old paper. A young man in a gray sweater looked up from behind the reception desk, his expression caught somewhere between boredom and suspicion. "Can I help you?" he asked. "I need to talk to a reporter," Samuel said. His voice sounded rough, even to himself. "Something about the old Reynolds transport plant." The kid's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Reynolds? That place closed 30 years ago." "I know," Samuel said, reaching into his bag and pulling out one of the photographs. "That's why you need to hear this." The young man hesitated, then motioned toward a hallway. "You can talk to Mr. Doyle. He's the editor. He'll decide if it's worth a story." Doyle's office was cluttered, papers stacked high, coffee rings staining the desk, the air thick with the smell of cigarettes. The man himself looked like he hadn't slept in days. He wore a wrinkled shirt and a tie loosened halfway down his chest. When Samuel entered, he barely glanced up. "What's this about?" Doyle asked, lighting another cigarette. Samuel laid the envelope on the desk and spread the papers out slowly. "I found something," he said. "Something from Reynolds. These are shipping manifests, and this," he held up the one with Coleman's signature. "This proves they were running illegal shipments under false names. Weapons, government contracts, maybe worse." Doyle took the paper between his fingers, squinted, and then laughed softly. "You got all this from a container, huh?" Samuel nodded. "Bought it from the Ironfield storage yard last week. Found an old company truck sealed inside." Doyle leaned back, exhaling smoke. "Look, Mr. Brown, was it? Stories like this don't move papers anymore. People don't care about 30-year-old scandals." "This isn't just about the past," Samuel said, his voice rising. "The man who signed those papers, Coleman, he's still out there. He's a senator now. He built his career off money that wasn't his. Off us." Doyle stopped smiling. "Coleman?" He turned the paper over, tracing the signature with his finger. "You sure about this?" "I worked for him," Samuel said. "I saw his name every day for 20 years. I'd know it anywhere." The editor sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "I'm not saying I don't believe you, Mr. Brown, but accusations like this, without verifiable records, they can ruin people. And if you're wrong, they'll ruin you too." Samuel gathered the papers slowly, his jaw tight. "I'm already ruined," he said, "but I'm right." When he left the office, the sky had darkened further. The first drops of rain splattered against his jacket. He walked back to the van. the weight of rejection heavy in his chest. He knew the man was scared of printing something that could cost him his job, maybe his paper. But Samuel also knew fear had been the thing keeping people silent for too long. He couldn't let it stop him. As he drove out of town, the rain turned heavier. By the time he reached the yard, it was falling in thick sheets, drumming against the van roof. He killed the engine and sat there, watching the water slide down the windshield. For a long time, he did nothing. Then something flickered in his rearview mirror. Headlights, faint but steady, parked at the far edge of the street. He turned to look, but the light vanished behind the curtain of rain. Maybe it was just another driver turning around. Maybe not. A chill crawled up his spine. He waited a few minutes, then climbed out, the rain soaking through his jacket instantly. The container loomed ahead, the air humming with thunder. He unlocked the door and stepped inside, setting the satchel down on the crate. He checked the truck again, searching for anything he might have missed. He was kneeling by the rear tire when he heard it, a metallic clink, faint, somewhere outside. He froze. The sound came again. A soft scrape, like footsteps on gravel. Samuel killed the flashlight and crouched low, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. For several seconds there was only the sound of rain. Then he saw it. A shadow moving past the open door, just a flicker of motion, gone as quickly as it appeared. He held his breath. The rain masked everything, turning the world into a blur of sound. He waited, counting the seconds. Nothing. Slowly, he stepped forward and peered out. The yard was empty. When he turned back, the papers he'd left on the crate had shifted slightly, as though brushed by a hand. He swallowed hard. The fear that had been circling his mind for days finally found shape. Someone knew about the container. That night, he barely left the workshop. He sat by the small stove in the corner, staring at the documents spread out before him. He tried to think who could have been following him. Maybe someone from the auction company. Maybe someone who worked for Coleman. He'd heard stories about men who'd come forward with accusations only to vanish before anyone could prove them true. By midnight, the rain stopped. The yard was quiet again, eerily so. He stood and walked to the window, looking out across the dark. The puddles reflected the faint glow of the street lights. His reflection in the glass looked like another man entirely. Older, worn, but harder somehow. He knew what he had to do now. The Gazette wouldn't help, not the police either. He'd need someone who wasn't afraid, someone who still believed in truth. He thought of an old acquaintance, June Lawson, a freelance journalist who'd written about factory corruption years ago before she'd been blacklisted. If anyone would care about what he'd found, it would be her. But even as the plan formed, a deep unease lingered. Whoever had been outside earlier, whoever had touched those papers, they wouldn't stop now. He had opened something that others had spent decades keeping sealed. He doused the stove and turned off the lights, locking the doors behind him. As he walked back to his van, the night air felt thick and heavy. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and went silent. The quiet pressed in around him, too complete, too intentional. He climbed into the van and locked the doors, keeping his satchel on the seat beside him. Sleep came in fragments, broken by every creak of the wind. Once, he thought he heard the soft crunch of tires on gravel, but when he looked out, there was nothing. Still, he knew deep down the same truth he'd known since he opened that container. He wasn't alone in this anymore. By morning, The first light revealed the tracks of a vehicle that hadn't been there the night before, fresh tread marks cutting through the mud near the entrance of the yard. Samuel stared at them for a long moment, then turned his gaze back to the container. It stood silent and massive, its metal skin glinting faintly in the weak sunlight as if mocking him. He felt fear creeping up the back of his neck, but also something sharper beneath it. Determination. They might watch him, they might try to scare him, but he wouldn't stop. The past had already taken enough from him. Now it was his turn to drag it into the light. He stepped forward, his boots sinking into the wet ground, and unlocked the container again. The hinges screamed in protest. Inside, the truck waited, still impatient, surrounded by the faint smell of oil and rain. Samuel ran his fingers along the hood one last time, whispering under his breath, "You've kept your secrets long enough." Then he closed the doors, sealed them with a new lock, and turned toward town. It was time to find someone who would listen. And as he drove away, he didn't notice the black sedan parked 2 blocks down the road, engine idling, watching him disappear into the haze. The road out of Ironfield stretched long and empty under a pale sky, the kind of washed-out morning that carried no warmth, only light. Samuel drove with both hands on the wheel, the satchel of documents resting on the passenger seat beside him like a passenger with secrets of its own. He hadn't bothered with breakfast, and the bitter taste of old coffee still lingered on his tongue. Sleep had been a stranger again. The memory of the black sedan that had watched him from the shadows stayed behind his eyes like a burn. He told himself it might have been coincidence, but in his gut he knew better. Someone knew what he had uncovered, and someone wanted it kept buried. He drove north toward the neighboring city, the same direction freight trucks used to take when Reynolds and Company still ran convoys through the industrial belt. The landscape outside the windows passed like old film, abandoned warehouses, billboard skeletons, fields turned gray by winter. Every mile felt like moving deeper into the past. He kept the radio off. The silence was thick enough to think in, though his thoughts came in waves, crashing one over another. He reached out once, adjusting the rearview mirror, and saw only the empty highway behind him. No taillights, no cars. The sense of being followed lingered anyway, a weight between his shoulder blades. He'd seen men crumble under less pressure. But fear had a way of losing its edge when a man had already lost everything worth taking. When the first outlines of the city rose through the haze, he felt a strange mix of relief and dread. The traffic thickened, horns blaring, neon signs flickering to life even in daylight. He found a diner near the river and pulled in beside a line of delivery trucks. The inside smelled of bacon and burnt toast, the kind of smell that made him remember lunch breaks at the factory, half an hour of laughter and noise before returning to the grind. He ordered coffee and sat in a booth by the window, the satchel never leaving his side. He opened his notebook and wrote down a name at the top of a blank page. June Lawson. He'd met her once, years ago, when she'd interviewed workers after the plant closure. She'd been the only journalist who'd bothered to show up, the only one who didn't treat them like statistics. She'd written a piece called The Silence of Ironfield, but the story had vanished before publication. He remembered reading somewhere that she'd left the paper after clashing with editors over government pressure. After that, she disappeared from the headlines. Samuel asked around, calling a few numbers he'd found online for independent reporters. One of them gave him a lead, a name connected to an online archive of investigative work. "She doesn't take calls from strangers," the man warned. "If you find her, make sure you have something real." Samuel smiled grimly. "I do." It took most of the afternoon to track her down. She lived in a small house outside the city near the rail line, the kind of place someone chose when they didn't want to be found. The garden was overgrown, but the mailbox still bore her name. He parked across the street, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment, watching the curtains for movement. Then he climbed out, walked up the path, and knocked. The door opened after a pause. A woman in her 50s stood there, short hair streaked with gray, eyes sharp behind rimless glasses. She looked at him as if measuring whether he was trouble. "Yes?" "My name's Samuel Brown," he said. "We met once, a long time ago. You came to Ironfield after the Reynolds shut down." Something flickered in her expression, a faint recognition or maybe caution. "That was 30 years ago." "I still remember," he said. "You asked us what it felt like to be replaced by numbers." Her mouth tightened. "I remember you now, the mechanic who wouldn't talk on camera." "I didn't think it would matter back then," he admitted. "Turns out I was wrong." He handed her one of the photographs. She took it reluctantly, studying the image of the truck and the factory lot behind it. Her brow furrowed. "Where did you get this?" "I bought a shipping container at auction," he said. "This was inside, along with manifests, Coleman's signature. I think Reynolds was running illegal shipments through the yard, and I think Coleman used the collapse to cover it up." June stepped aside. "Come in." The inside of her home was filled with stacks of newspapers, boxes of files, and the faint hum of an old refrigerator. She cleared a spot on the table, motioned for him to sit, then poured coffee for them both. "Coleman," she said quietly. "You mean Senator Raymond Coleman?" Samuel nodded. "Same man. I worked under him." June sat across from him, flipping through the papers he'd brought. Her face remained calm, but he saw the tension in her jaw. "These are authentic," she said finally. "The company letterhead matches records from the period. If this is true, Coleman didn't just hide financial misconduct. He laundered federal contracts through a private transport company and left hundreds jobless to bury the trail." She leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Why now, after all this time?" "Because I found it," he said. "Because it ruined too many lives, and I'm done pretending it didn't ruin mine." For a while, neither spoke. Outside, a train passed, the sound low and steady. June rubbed her temples. "You understand what happens if we go public with this? He'll deny it. You'll be called a liar, maybe worse. Men like Coleman don't stay in power by being careless." "I know," he said, "but I'm tired of being silent. I need this out there." June studied him for a moment longer, then nodded. "All right, we'll verify what we can. I still have contacts at a few outlets that haven't sold their souls yet, but if this goes forward, we'll both be targets." He managed a faint smile. "You sound like my kind of person." They spent hours cross-checking documents. June scanned the signatures, compared shipment codes, and pulled up old government contract records from archived databases. Every connection they traced led back to the same network of shell companies tied to Coleman's early career. By evening, the table was covered with notes and printouts. At one point, June paused and looked at him. "You kept all this in the open?" "In my van," he said. "Why?" Her eyes darkened. "Then they already know." He didn't ask who they were. He didn't need to. The silence that followed said enough. When he left her house that night, he felt both lighter and more exposed. The documents were in safer hands now, but the knowledge that others would come looking for them made every shadow seem sharper. He drove back toward Ironfield, headlights cutting through the mist. Halfway there, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It read, "Stop digging, Brown. It's over. He stared at the screen until the light from it hurt his eyes, then threw the phone onto the seat. The threat didn't scare him. It only confirmed everything. By the time he reached the yard, the air had turned thick with fog again. He parked by the container and killed the lights, listening to the tick of the cooling engine. The silence felt wrong, stretched too thin. He stepped out slowly, scanning the dark. The container door stood ajar. He froze. He was sure he'd locked it before leaving. He approached quietly, heart hammering. The door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing the shadowed interior. The truck was still there, but the crates had been disturbed, lids pried open, papers scattered across the floor. Whoever had been here hadn't been looking for scrap. They'd been looking for the same thing he had. Samuel knelt and picked up a torn page from one of the manifests. The section with Coleman's name was missing. He searched the rest of the container, but the missing pages were gone. Someone had taken the most damning evidence. He stood in the doorway, anger boiling beneath the fear. Whoever they were, they'd made a mistake by leaving the rest. Enough remained to prove something real. Enough to keep fighting. He gathered what was left, locked the doors with a new chain, and drove straight back to June's house through the night. She answered the door in her robe, eyes wide when she saw his face. "They've been there," he said. "Took part of it." She let him in without a word. They worked until dawn, piecing together what was left. The missing pages made their job harder, but not impossible. June uploaded digital copies of the remaining manifests to secure servers, labeling each one under anonymous codes. When morning came, the first story went live on a small independent news site under the headline, "Former Reynolds Worker Uncovers Hidden Records Linking Senator Coleman to Defunct Freight Scheme." It was small, almost invisible, but the spark had been lit. Within hours, other outlets picked it up. Some mocked it, others questioned its legitimacy. But the conversation had begun. And for the first time since buying that rusted container, Samuel felt something close to hope, but hope came with danger. The second day after the publication, his van was broken into while he was at a grocery store. Nothing was stolen except his notebook. He found the door left open, the glove compartment emptied. No fingerprints, no note, just absence. That night, he sat alone by the stove in June's kitchen while she fielded calls from reporters and former factory workers who had seen the article. The responses were mixed. Some angry, some grateful, others frightened. The truth was spreading, but so was the shadow that followed it. June hung up the phone and turned to him. "You can still walk away," she said softly. "You've already done enough." He shook his head. "Not until they can't bury it again." She gave a small, tired smile. "Then we keep going." Outside, dawn broke slow and uncertain, the kind of light that blurred the line between day and night. Samuel stepped onto the porch and looked out across the mist rising from the fields. The cold bit at his skin, but he didn't mind. Somewhere behind that fog, men like Coleman still believed they owned the truth. They'd underestimated how stubborn a broken man could be when given something real to stand for. He thought of the workers who'd lost everything, of the faces he still remembered from the factory floor, and felt a steady calm settle in his chest. He had spent half his life surviving. Now he was fighting. For them, for himself, for the truth rusted shut and waiting all these years to be opened. Behind him, June's voice broke the quiet. "They'll come harder now," she said. "You ready for that?" Samuel turned to her, his eyes steady. "I've been ready for 30 years. The story spread like a slow-burning fire, starting small and almost invisible, then gathering strength as it found new oxygen. Within days, Samuel's name began to appear in headlines, first on fringe news sites, then in larger regional outlets that had ignored Ironfield for decades. Most of them didn't know who he was. Some called him a whistleblower, others a conspiracy theorist. But every article carried the same thread. Senator Raymond Coleman, the man who built his reputation on integrity and reform, was being accused by a former factory worker of burying evidence tied to illegal government shipments in the 1980s. Samuel didn't feel like a whistleblower. He felt like a man trying to breathe while the past dragged him under. Every morning, he woke to the sound of June's phone buzzing. Reporters, lawyers, former employees of Reynolds and Company calling to confirm what they remembered. Some cried. Some shouted. A few begged them to stop. The truth, once unearthed, didn't bring peace. It brought chaos. The first real sign that the story was working came 3 days later when a local television station ran a segment showing grainy footage of the container sitting behind Samuel's workshop. The reporter's voice was steady, but there was an edge of excitement. What began as an online post by a former mechanic, she said, has now caught the attention of federal investigators. They showed photos of the documents June had uploaded, blurred at the edges, and then a brief clip of Coleman walking into his office, refusing to answer questions. Samuel watched from June's living room, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee gone cold. The sight of Coleman, still tall, still immaculate, stirred something sharp in him. The years hadn't softened the man's arrogance. He carried himself with the same confidence that once commanded a factory floor full of men who depended on him for their wages. Watching him now, denying everything with practiced calm, made Samuel's blood burn. June muted the television and looked over at him. "He's not rattled yet," she said. "Men like that never show fear until they start losing control. But this," she gestured toward the screen, "this is how it begins." He nodded but didn't answer. In his chest, pride wrestled with dread. The truth was finally out, but truth had never protected anyone in Ironfield. That night, the wind came hard off the river, shaking the windows. Samuel sat at the kitchen table with the papers spread out before him. He'd memorized every line of them by now, every signature, every coded reference. He thought of the missing pages, the ones taken during the break-in, and wondered where they were now. Maybe locked in a drawer in some senator's office. Maybe burning in a barrel behind a warehouse. He couldn't stop thinking that without those pages, the case might crumble. June joined him, setting down a folder filled with notes. "I've got confirmation from a former auditor," she said. "He remembers anomalies in the company's books, but he was told to stay quiet. He's willing to talk if we can guarantee anonymity." "Will that be enough?" Samuel asked. "Enough to keep the story alive," she said. "And sometimes that's all you can do, keep it alive until it starts moving on its own." He rubbed his temples, exhaustion creeping through his bones. "You ever think maybe some things are buried for a reason?" She looked at him sharply. "You don't mean that?" "No," he said, staring at the papers, "but I understand why some people do. It's easier to live with lies when the truth costs too much." She leaned back, folding her arms. "Then why are you still here, Sam?" He didn't answer immediately. Outside, a car passed on the distant road, its headlights flashing briefly through the window. "Because I'm tired of paying for their lies," he said finally. The following morning, 2 federal agents arrived at June's house. They introduced themselves politely, but their eyes betrayed caution. They asked for the original documents, promising to review them as part of an official investigation. June refused to hand them over. "Copies only," she said, her tone clipped. The agents exchanged a look that made Samuel uneasy. They took the copies, thanked them both, and left without shaking hands. "Something's off," he muttered as they drove away. June nodded. "They're too calm. Either they already know what we found, or they've been told to make it disappear quietly." The next few days blurred together. Threats came online, anonymous comments calling Samuel a liar, accusing him of fabricating evidence for money. Someone painted the words "traitor" across the door of his workshop in red spray paint. He washed it off without saying a word. Fear had long ago turned into a kind of numb resolve. Then, one evening, the Gazette, the same paper that had refused to print his story weeks earlier, released a statement claiming new information casts doubt on the authenticity of the documents. They cited unverified sources and inconsistencies in the timeline. Samuel read the article 3 times, each sentence cutting deeper. It was coordinated, he realized. Coleman's people were fighting back. He threw the newspaper into the trash and sat down heavily. June's face was pale as she read the same piece on her laptop. "They're trying to bury it again," she said quietly. "They're turning you into the villain." "Let them," he said. "I didn't start this for them." But the attacks worked. Calls from reporters stopped. The online chatter slowed. The investigation stalled without the missing pages. The fire they had started flickered dangerously close to going out. That's when June made a decision. "We'll go to the Capitol," she said. "Face him directly. If Coleman won't answer questions, we'll bring them to his doorstep." Samuel hesitated. "You think he'll even let us near him?" She smiled without humor. "He doesn't have to. Cameras will." 2 days later, they were on the road, driving through miles of flat land under a sky the color of old steel. Samuel watched the horizon while June prepared her notes, her phone buzzing with calls from small outlets willing to cover the confrontation. The drive was long, and the closer they got, the more he felt the weight of years pressing down. He thought of the factory again, how it had smelled of grease and smoke, how the men used to laugh during lunch breaks. He thought of Coleman walking through the aisles, shaking hands, promising stability. "We're building the future," he'd said once, standing on the loading dock. "You're the backbone of this country." And then he'd sold that backbone for profit. By the time they reached the city, dusk was settling. Coleman was scheduled to attend a fundraising gala that evening, and June had arranged for a journalist friend to get them access to the crowd outside. The air buzzed with voices and camera flashes. When Coleman's car arrived, a swarm of reporters surged forward. June stepped up beside Samuel, her recorder ready. "You sure about this?" she asked. He nodded. "I've been sure since the day I opened that container." When Coleman stepped out of the car, his smile was smooth, his hair perfect, his presence commanding. He waved to the crowd, shaking hands with donors and photographers. Then he saw Samuel. The smile faltered, just slightly, but it was enough. "Senator Coleman," June called out, "can you comment on the allegations concerning Reynolds Transport and the missing federal shipments?" He turned toward her, expression tightening. "Old rumors," he said smoothly. "Baseless claims from disgruntled former employees. We've already provided full cooperation with the authorities." Samuel took a step forward. "You lied to all of us, Ray. You stole from us." His voice cut through the noise, and for a heartbeat the crowd went still. Coleman's gaze met his, cold and calculating. "I don't know who you are," the senator said, though his eyes betrayed recognition. "Yes, you do," Samuel said quietly. "I was one of your men. You took everything from us, our jobs, our futures, and buried the truth under steel and dirt. But it's out now, and you can't hide it anymore." Coleman's security moved in quickly, steering him toward the entrance. The senator didn't look back, but the damage was done. Cameras caught every word. Within hours, the clip was circulating online. The next morning, June's phone rang nonstop. Some called to congratulate them, others to warn them. Coleman's office released another statement denying all allegations, calling Samuel a disturbed individual chasing attention. But denial only fed the fire this time. More former employees came forward. Old accountants, truck drivers, even a few retired government clerks, all confirming small pieces of the story. Individually, they meant little. Together, they built a pattern. Federal authorities reopened the investigation officially. Subpoenas were issued. Coleman's office scrambled. And yet, despite the headlines, Samuel felt no triumph. Each revelation seemed to carve a little more out of him, leaving a hollow behind. Truth, he realized, was heavy. It didn't set you free. It made you responsible. June tried to celebrate small victories. "You started something, Sam," she told him one night as they sat outside, the city lights reflecting off the river. "You woke people up." He stared at the water. "Yeah, now I just have to live with it." The weeks that followed blurred into hearings, interviews, and noise. Coleman's empire began to crack. Donations froze, political allies distanced themselves. Whispers of criminal charges surfaced. But Samuel stayed quiet. He'd done his part. The rest belonged to those who still had something left to lose. One cold morning, he returned to Ironfield. The yard was empty, the air sharp and still. The container stood exactly where he had left it, paint flaking, the number 47B barely visible under layers of rust. He ran his hand along the metal, feeling the roughness beneath his fingers. He had opened it, hoping to find scrap, something to sell for a few dollars. Instead, he had found the bones of a crime, the echo of everything he had lost. Now it felt like the last monument to a past finally coming undone. He locked the gate behind him and stood there for a while, watching the sun rise over the broken skyline. Somewhere, far away, the world was still talking about the story, about Coleman and corruption and justice. But here, in the silence of Ironfield, there was only peace. A quiet that didn't need headlines. Samuel took a deep breath and smiled faintly. The truth was no longer his burden to carry. It had a life of its own now, moving through the world like light through rust, revealing what had always been there, waiting to be seen. The winter wind came down from the hills in long, steady breaths, carrying with it the scent of iron and rain. Ironfield had never looked more like its name. Gray, brittle, skeletal. The streets were half frozen, the factory windows boarded up like blind eyes staring across decades of decay. Samuel walked slowly through the yard behind his workshop, his hands deep in the pockets of his coat. The container stood there as it always had, the rust on its sides deepening into dark veins, the paint peeling in thin curls that whispered against the wind. It had stopped feeling like an object long ago. Now it felt like a grave. Not just of a secret or a company, but of an era, of a life that had once meant something before it was sold off piece by piece. It had been nearly 4 months since the confrontation with Coleman. The investigation was still ongoing, though slower now, tangled in hearings and legal maneuvers. Coleman had not been arrested, but the Senate had opened an ethics inquiry, and several of his former business associates had resigned. The fire Samuel had started had burned far beyond what he'd imagined, but it hadn't brought the satisfaction he thought it might. Justice, he was learning, didn't arrive like thunder. It came like rust, slow, creeping, inevitable, but rarely clean. The town hadn't changed. A few locals still passed by his yard now and then, nodding politely but never lingering. Some had seen his face on the news and looked at him differently now, half pride, half pity. To them, he was the man who dug up the past and made noise the world briefly listened to. Then the noise faded, as all noise does, swallowed by new scandals, new headlines, new distractions. The world moved on. Ironfield didn't. He still worked, though not as much as before. The shop was quiet most days. He fixed small engines, patched up generators, replaced the odd transmission. People trusted him again, but they didn't quite know how to talk to him. Sometimes they'd linger by the door after paying, waiting as if he might say something profound about the truth or the fight he'd taken on. He never did. He'd learned that truth didn't need sermons. It needed silence and patience. June had gone back to the city. Her articles were now part of a larger investigation coordinated by several independent reporters. They called her the Ironfield Voice in some circles, though she'd never claimed the title. She called Samuel once a week to update him, sometimes about new evidence, sometimes just to make sure he was still breathing. She had become his only link to the outside world. He didn't tell her, but he had grown afraid of leaving Ironfield again. The noise of cities made him feel like he was drowning. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the warehouse roofs, a car pulled into the yard. It was old, but well kept, a dark blue sedan that hummed softly as it idled. Samuel watched from the doorway of his workshop, the light of his cigarette glowing faintly in the dusk. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out. Tall, sharply dressed, wearing an overcoat despite the mild cold. For a moment, Samuel thought he recognized him, and then he did. It was one of Coleman's aides, a face he'd seen on television during the hearings. The man approached, boots crunching against gravel. "Mr. Brown," he said, voice steady, "you've been hard to find." Samuel didn't move. "I wasn't hiding." "Didn't think you were." The aide's tone was polite but clipped. "I came on behalf of Senator Coleman." Samuel flicked the cigarette into the dirt. "That right? I thought he stopped sending people to do his talking." The aide gave a thin smile. "He still talks, but he prefers certain conversations to happen quietly." He paused, glancing toward the container. "That's where it started, isn't it? The big discovery." Samuel's jaw tightened. "Say what you came to say." The man took a step closer. "You've made your point. The world heard your story, but dragging this out won't help anyone. Coleman's not going to prison. Too many hands are dirty for that to happen. So maybe it's time to let the dust settle. For your sake." Samuel stared at him for a long moment, then turned toward the workshop. "You can tell him I've got no interest in revenge," he said. "But if he wants the world to forget, he's a fool. The truth's already out." "Truth," the aide said softly, almost with pity. "Truth is what people choose to remember." He turned back to his car, pausing once to look at the container again before leaving. The sound of the engine faded into the distance, leaving only the whistle of the wind through the yard. Samuel stood there long after the car disappeared, his pulse steady but heavy. He knew the man was right in one sense. Coleman would never see the inside of a cell. Men like that didn't. They paid fines, resigned, vanished behind gated walls, and reemerged years later under different titles. Justice, in the end, was a language they spoke fluently, but even knowing that didn't erase what Samuel had done. He had forced them to look back, to see the rot they had buried. For a brief moment, he had made the powerful tremble. That night, he walked out to the container with a flashlight. The lock was cold beneath his hand. He hadn't opened it since the day he'd returned from the city. Slowly, he slid the bolt free and pulled the doors wide. The smell of oil and time hit him like a memory. Inside, the truck sat silent, the metal gleaming faintly under the light. He ran his palm along the hood. It was cold but solid, the last proof that something once hidden could still be touched, still be real. He sat on a crate, the beam of the flashlight resting against the opposite wall. The container's walls creaked softly as the night wind pressed against them. He thought about the men he'd worked with, their laughter, their sweat, their anger. He thought about the day the gates closed, how they'd all scattered, how some had never recovered. He thought about his sons, now grown, living their lives far from here. He hadn't spoken to them since the story broke. He didn't blame them. The past was heavy enough without inheriting someone else's ghosts. His eyes drifted over the truck's dashboard, the faded logo, the missing mirrors. It was beautiful in its way, a monument to endurance, like the people who built it, like the town that refused to die no matter how many times it was declared finished. Sometime after midnight, he closed the doors again, sealing the darkness inside. As he turned to leave, he noticed the faint glimmer of frost on the padlock. He reached out and touched it, feeling the bite of cold steel against his fingers. It grounded him, pulled him back to the present. For all the noise and chaos the past months had brought, life went on, slow, steady, indifferent. Over the next weeks, letters began arriving in his mailbox. Some were from old co-workers thanking him, others from strangers who'd read the story and wanted to say they believed him. A few were cruel, accusations of attention-seeking, of lying, of destroying a man's career. He read them all, folded them neatly, and kept them in a shoebox under his bed. He wasn't looking for praise or pity. He just wanted to remember that the truth had reached someone, even if only for a moment. June visited once in early spring. The snow had melted, and the river was swollen with rain. She looked older, thinner, but her eyes still burned with that relentless fire. They sat on the porch, drinking coffee, the silence between them comfortable. "He's stepping down," she said finally. Samuel looked at her. "Coleman?" She nodded. "Citing health reasons, but word is the investigation found enough to make his position untenable. He'll keep his wealth, but his name's finished." He nodded slowly, taking in the words without joy. "So that's it then." "For him," she said. "For you, it's whatever comes next." He smiled faintly. "I'm not sure there is a next. I've done what I came to do." She studied him for a moment, then looked out toward the yard. "You know, stories like yours, they never really end. People just stop paying attention. But that's the thing about truth, Sam. It doesn't care if anyone's listening. It just keeps being true." He chuckled softly. "You should put that in a headline." She laughed, shaking her head. "Doesn't sell papers." When she left later that afternoon, the yard fell silent again. Samuel watched her car disappear down the road until it was just a shimmer in the distance. Then he turned back to the workshop, the hum of old engines filling the air like a song from another life. In the months that followed, he worked steadily, quietly. The town began to breathe again. Small businesses reopening, a new company renting space in one of the old factories. Sometimes, when he walked through the streets, he saw faces he hadn't seen in years. Men who had once worn the same grease-stained coveralls, now older but still standing. They greeted him with nods, sometimes a handshake. None of them said thank you, not out loud, but he didn't need them to. The fact they were still there was enough. One evening, as the sun slipped low and the sky turned the color of steel dust, he returned to the container one last time. He unlocked the doors and stood there, staring into the dim interior. The truck sat exactly as before, its shape outlined in shadow. For a long while, he simply watched, the past and present merging in the quiet. Then he stepped inside, placed his hand on the hood, and whispered, "Rest easy." He left the doors open that night, the wind flowing through, carrying with it the sound of distant trains and the faint scent of rain. When morning came, the light spilled inside, painting everything gold. The rust gleamed like fire. Samuel stood there a while longer, watching the light shift across the metal. Then he turned away, locking the gate behind him as he walked toward the road. His steps were slow, steady, unburdened. Ironfield would never be what it once was. Neither would he. But somewhere deep beneath the ruin and the rust, beneath the silence and the years, the truth had taken root. And, in its quiet, stubborn way, it would keep growing long after the noise had gone. If this story kept you watching till the end, don't stop here. Hit subscribe, share this video, and check out the next one. The truth always hides in plain sight.